saying to them, Matthew, Mark, and says to them, Luke, saying. Matthew, go into the village opposite you, and immediately you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her. Loose them and bring them to me. In Mark, he says, go your way into the village opposite you, and as soon as you be entered into it, you shall find a colt tied, whereon never man sat. Loose him and bring him. So Matthew, them, although those words are in italics, that's added. Whereas in Mark, it clearly says, loose him and bring. The first him is not in italics, so that's there. It's only talking about one. Luke, go into the village opposite you, in which at you entering you shall find a colt tied, whereon yet never man sat. Loose him and bring him here. The him here is in italics, but the first him is regular, so that's for sure. So I'm going to go with just one, not both. I'll include an ass tied and a colt with her, because the ass is a her, the him is the colt, and it's important that Jesus was riding on the colt, because this is a quote from Zechariah 9:3, 9:9. I was wrong there. Zechariah 9:9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king comes to you. He is just, having salvation lowly, riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. So a colt is a young ass, a young donkey. And the reason that it says, and upon the colt, the foal of an ass, whereas before it says an ass, I think that it's like a more descriptive way of saying. Throughout the Bible, this is used. They'll explain something, and then they'll go on to say even a more descriptive explanation. So if I was to say, you're going into Egypt, even to slavery in Egypt, it gives a general description and then a more specific description, and I think that's what's going on here. He's riding on an ass, and a colt, the foal of an ass. I think it's just being more descriptive, saying specifically a young donkey. And that is important because horses are for battle, but donkeys are for kings. It's a sign of importance. And specifically, Jesus riding on a donkey was so well known as a sign of kingliness that was him openly declaring to all of Israel and to everyone in Jerusalem, yes, he is telling everyone he's the king, which means he is the Messiah. That was one of the most open declarations, because the Messiah is the son of David, which means he would be the king. A king rides on a donkey that no one else rides. It's reserved for just the king. So it was very important that no one had rode on it before. That would be much more likely with a very young colt, especially if Jesus tells his two disciples, you'll see a donkey and with her a colt. Very young enough that no one has probably ridden him before. So all those reasons are why he wasn't riding on two, he was riding on one, the younger, because it was reserved for him and it was a declaration of his kingship. Go into the village opposite you, and immediately you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her. I'm going to include that. Mark, it says, go your way into the village opposite you, so I'll include your way. Luke, go into the village opposite you. I'll start with the way, and then into the village opposite you, I think is in all three. Except you is in italics in Luke. So I'll have gray up until the word you. Matthew says, and immediately you shall find an ass tied and a colt with her. Immediately. Mark says, and as soon As you be entered into it, you shall find a colt tied, wherein never man sat. Okay, so, and as soon or immediately, they mean the same thing. I think I might have to just pick. In the which at your entering, you shall find a colt tied. Okay, at your entering, that does explain the same thing. It's right away. That's the point. It's right away. Into which at your entering. I don't know if I could mix Mark in there. I could say, in the which at your entering, over to Matthew, immediately you shall find. I don't know if I can mix Mark in there because it says, as soon as you be entered into it. In the which at your entering. I'm going to put it from Mark because it's talking about the village. Yeah, I'll try that. Okay. In the which at your entering it. Matthew, and immediately you shall find. I'll just put immediately you shall find. You shall find from all three. Matthew. I want to include the fact that there is an ass and a colt tied and a colt with her. A colt is all three. Matthew doesn't mention that no one rode on the colt yet. But Mark does, whereon never man sat. Luke? Yes, whereon yet never man sat. So I'm going to include yet from Luke. Whereon from both. Luke yet, back to both, never man sat. The issue of the differences between the account of the disciples going to get the colt that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. Matthew specifically states, verse 7, they brought the ass and the colt and put on them their clothes, and they set him thereon. So it seems very clear that both the mother donkey and the son colt were brought to Jesus. Both of them had their coats laid on them, and they set him thereon. Jesus sat thereon. Other versions say they put their coats on them and he sat on them, which adds to the confusion. Did he sit on both? I am absolutely convinced, especially because of the other gospel accounts, Jesus did not somehow find a way to sit on both at one time. I also don't think he sat on one and then sat on the other, which would be the explanation that he sat on both. I don't think so. I think he just sat on the colt. Explained in Mark and Luke, he only sat on the colt. But in Matthew, it says that both were brought. In Matthew 21, verse 7, they definitely brought an ass and its colt. In Matthew 21:3, it shows that Jesus definitely said both would be sent by the questioner, the one who came out to ask them what they're doing. I'll read that. Jesus said, and if any man say anything to you, you shall say, the Lord has need of them, not italics, and immediately he will send them, not italics, them meaning the ass and the colt. Earlier, the them are in italics, so there's room to say maybe that was just an incorrect translation and Jesus only sent them to get the colt. John, a little bit later on, Jesus, when he found a young ass, sat thereon, as it is written, "Fear not, daughter of Zion." He quotes Zechariah. So Jesus sat on the young ass, the colt. Mark and Luke and John agree he sat on the colt. Matthew, it is abundantly clear that they brought both and they set their coats on them and Jesus sat thereon. He sat, but it doesn't say he sat on them both, not in the King James Version.
These passages taken together bring up the question, why were the mother and the colt both brought for Jesus to ride on?
The mother was there for the sake of the colt because she would ensure the colt would not buck or bray or become too stubborn to move when confronted by the shouting crowds and being ridden for the first time in its life, because a king's donkey is for the king alone. That right there solidified it for me. That's why the mother was there, because this colt is young. No one had ridden on it before. It would not be accustomed to being ridden and to being around shouting crowds. So the mother would have been there, would have made it much more comfortable for the colt to continue following along and to keep going without getting stubborn. Both were there, both were brought, so because of that, I'm going to include that from Matthew. Loose him and bring him here. Luke. Loose him and bring him is in Mark. Matthew says, loose them and bring them to me. Loose them and bring them to me. Now it reads like this, saying to them, go your way into the village opposite you, in the which at your entering it, immediately you shall find an ass tied, and a colt with her, whereon yet never man sat. Loose them and bring them to me.